religious practices in human history, and his symbols still appear everywhere around us today. Before we begin this journey into the shadows, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments below, because Saturn's influence reached every corner of the ancient world, and I want to see how far his modern mysteries have spread. Although Saturn has gained renewed attention thanks to modern conspiracy theories and strange symbols we see everywhere from corporate logos to Hollywood movies, his story is much older and far more disturbing than most people realize. We're talking about a deity whose worship involved the systematic sacrifice of children, whose priests held secret knowledge about manipulating time itself, and whose festivals turned the entire Roman social order upside down for weeks at a time. Known as the Lord of Time and the Devourer of Children, Saturn is the Roman version of the Greek god Kronos, the ruler who literally ate his own babies alive to prevent them from overthrowing him. But this wasn't just a myth that people told, and his influence stretched across the civilized world for over 800 years. What makes this truly terrifying? Saturn wasn't just worshipped as some simple god of farming like most history books tell you. He was considered the master of time itself, death, and the harsh lessons that break people's spirits and reshape their souls. His priests claimed they could predict the future, control the seasons, and even extend or shorten human lives through their secret rituals. The Roman government was so afraid of Saturn's power that they kept his main statue chained up for 11 months of the year, only setting him free during the darkest days of winter, when his followers believed he walked the earth in physical form. What makes Saturn's worship so special that it survived the fall of Rome and still influences our world today? What dark secrets did his priests really know about controlling time and human behavior? And what does his constant appearance in modern movies, government buildings, and corporate symbols actually mean for us right now? Join us as we uncover all the mysteries and dark secrets of the cult of Saturn, because understanding his ancient power might be the key to recognizing his influence in our modern world. To understand Saturn's true power and why his cult became so influential, we need to go back to the very beginning of recorded mythology. Long before Rome existed, and even before the Greeks wrote down their first stories, the oldest written source about Saturn comes from a Greek poet named Hesiod, who lived around 700 BC in a small village called Askra. Haskra wasn't just making up stories for entertainment. He was recording ancient oral traditions that had been passed down for generations, possibly thousands of years before he was even born. His most famous work, called the Theogony, which literally means birth of the gods, tells us that Saturn, originally called Kronos by the Greeks, was one of the Titans, the first and most powerful generation of gods who ruled the universe, before Zeus and the other Olympic gods took over. But here's where the story gets really dark and shows us just how brutal these ancient deities could be. According to Hesiod's account, Kronos didn't just rule peacefully like some wise king. He violently overthrew his own father, Uranus, the god of the sky, by hiding and waiting for the perfect moment to attack. When Uranus came down to mate with Gaia, the earth goddess, Kronos jumped out with a razor-sharp sickle, made from adamant, a material harder than diamond, and cut off his father's private parts, throwing them into the sea. The blood that dripped from this wound created the Furies, the goddesses of vengeance, while the severed parts fell into the ocean and created Aphrodite, the goddess of love. This tells us something important about Saturn's nature. He's connected to both creation and destruction, love and hate, life and death. The Romans later adopted this terrifying figure around the 6th century BC and renamed him Saturnus, making him one of their most important and feared deities. But the Romans didn't just copy the Greek stories. They added their own twisted elements that made Saturn even more disturbing. What most people don't realize is that Saturn wasn't considered some minor farming god, like many modern books claim. The Romans believed he was literally the founder of civilization itself, the god who taught humans how to grow crops, build cities, and create laws. They said he ruled during what they called the Saturnia, Regna, or Saturn's kingdom, which was their version of the Golden Age, a time when humans didn't need governments or police, because everyone was naturally good and honest. A terrible catch to this paradise that reveals Saturn's true nature. Saturn knew from a prophecy given by his parents, Uranus and Gaia, that one of his children would eventually overthrow him and take his power, just like he had done to his own father. This prophecy haunted Saturn and drove him to commit acts that were horrifying even by ancient standards. His solution was absolutely brutal. Every time his wife, Ops, also known as Rhea, gave birth to a child, Saturn would grab the newborn baby immediately after delivery and swallow it whole while it was still alive and screaming. He didn't kill them first, he ate them living, feeling them struggle in his throat as they went down. The Roman historian Macrobius, writing in the 5th century AD, gives us incredibly detailed information about how Saturn was actually worshipped in Rome itself for over 800 years. He tells us that Saturn's main temple, located at the foot of the Capitoline Hill in the heart of Rome, was built around 500 BC and contained a massive statue of the god that was unlike any other religious statue in the city. This statue showed Saturn as an elderly bearded man holding his famous sickle, but here's the really strange part. His hands and feet were bound with woolen chains that were kept on him for 11 months of every year. These chains were only removed once a year during the Saturnalia festival in December, when the Romans believed Saturn was temporarily set free to walk the earth. What makes this even more interesting is that Roman priests called the pontifices, who were basically the highest religious authorities in the empire, kept incredibly detailed records of Saturn's worship for over 800 years. These records, many of which survived until the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, documented thousands of animal sacrifices performed in Saturn's honor, including bulls, rams, and wild boars. But more disturbing are the references to human sacrifices, especially during times of war, famine, or political crisis. The historian Pliny the Elder mentions that children were sacrificed to Saturn as late as 100 BC, and archaeological evidence from Saturn temples across North Africa shows burial sites with the remains of infants and young children who appear to have been killed in ritualistic ways. If you're finding these ancient mysteries as fascinating as I am, consider subscribing for more deep dives into hidden knowledge that most people never hear about. The political power of Saturn's cult was absolutely massive and reached the very top of Roman society. The Roman Emperor Augustus himself participated in Saturn's secret rites, and historical records show that Julius Caesar consulted Saturn's priests before making his famous decision to cross the Rubicon River and march on Rome. This wasn't just religious ceremony for show. It was real political power mixed with ancient magic and secret knowledge. And the decisions made in Saturn's temples influenced events that shaped the entire Western world. Even more disturbing, Roman senators would sometimes delay important votes until after consulting Saturn's oracle, and several emperors, including Tiberius and Caligula, were known to visit Saturn's underground chambers beneath his temple for private rituals that were never recorded in official histories. The cult's influence spread far beyond Rome itself. As the empire expanded, Saturn temples were built in Britain, Spain, France, Germany, and throughout North Africa, each one staffed with priests who claimed direct descent from the original Roman cult. These priests maintained the same brutal traditions and secret knowledge, creating a network of Saturn worship that spanned the known world and lasted for centuries after the official fall of the Roman Empire. But what did Saturn actually look like when he appeared to his followers, and how did people recognize his presence? The ancient sources give us incredibly detailed descriptions that are both fascinating and terrifying. According to Roman religious texts and the accounts of priests who claim to have seen Saturn in visions, he appeared as an extremely old man, but not the kind of grandfather figure you might expect. Saturn was described as having long, wild gray hair that flowed down past his shoulders like a waterfall of silver, and his beard was so long it reached almost to his feet. But his eyes were the most disturbing feature, completely black, like looking into deep holes in the earth. And witnesses claimed that staring into Saturn's eyes made them feel like time was slipping away from them, like they were aging years in just seconds. His most famous feature was the massive scythe he carried everywhere. But this wasn't just any farming tool. Ancient descriptions tell us it was made from a dark metal that no one could identify, possibly meteoric iron that had fallen from space. And it was curved in a way that looked more like the letter C than a normal sickle. The blade was said to be so sharp it could cut through anything: stone, metal, even time itself, according to some accounts. Saturn would use this scythe not just to harvest crops, but to literally harvest human lives, cutting the invisible threads that connected souls to their bodies. Roman artists always showed Saturn holding this weapon, and temple statues had scythes made from real metal that priests would sharpen during religious ceremonies. But Saturn's appearance had some really strange contradictions that tell us about his complex nature. While he looked ancient and terrifying, he was also described as being incredibly strong and tall, sometimes appearing as a giant who towered over normal humans. His clothing was always described as being dark, usually black or deep purple robes, that seemed to absorb light around them. These robes were decorated with symbols that most people couldn't understand, including images of hourglasses, skulls, rings, and strange geometric patterns that looked like the planet Saturn's rings. The Roman writer Cicero mentions that Saturn's priests wore similar robes during ceremonies, and that looking at these symbols for too long could cause people to fall into trances or have visions of their own deaths. What's really interesting is how Saturn was said to announce his presence to mortals. Unlike other gods who might appear in dreams or send obvious signs, Saturn's arrival was much more subtle and disturbing. People would first notice that time seemed to be moving differently. Clocks would run slow or fast, shadows would move in the wrong directions, and seasons would change unexpectedly. Animals, especially crows and ravens, would gather in large numbers and make strange sounds that didn't match their normal calls. Plants would suddenly wither and die, or sometimes grow at impossible speeds, showing Saturn's power over the natural. Cycles of life and death. When Saturn actually appeared to someone in person, which happened very rarely according to the ancient accounts, the experience was absolutely terrifying. The temperature would drop dramatically, even in the middle of summer, and the person would feel an overwhelming sense of their own mortality. They would suddenly become aware of every second passing, feeling time like a physical weight pressing down on them. Many people who claimed to have seen Saturn said they could hear the ticking of an enormous clock that seemed to be counting down to something terrible, and some reported seeing hourglass shapes appearing in the air around them, with sand that moved upward instead of down. The most disturbing part of Saturn's manifestation was what happened to people's perception of their own bodies. Witnesses described feeling like they were rapidly aging and then becoming young again, over and over, as if Saturn was showing them the entire cycle of their life in fast forward. Some people said they could see their own skeletons through their skin, or that their hands would sometimes appear wrinkled and ancient even though they were young. This connection between Saturn and the physical experience of aging and death was so strong that Roman soldiers would pray to Saturn before battles, not for victory, but for a quick death if they were going to die. The protocols for interacting with Saturn were incredibly complex and dangerous, according to the ancient texts. His priests developed elaborate rituals that had to be performed during specific times of the year, always during the darkest months when Saturn's power was strongest. These ceremonies could only be conducted at night, between midnight and 3 a.m., when the barrier between the world of the living and the dead was thinnest. The priests would create circles made from salt mixed with ground bones, light black candles made from human fat, and burn incense that contained mysterious ingredients, including crushed meteorites and herbs that only grew in graveyards. Now, let's talk about what made Saturn so feared throughout the ancient world, his incredible and terrifying powers that went far beyond what most people think gods could do. The ancient texts don't just describe Saturn as powerful, they describe him as having abilities that could fundamentally change reality itself, which explains why even emperors and kings were afraid to anger him. Understanding Saturn's powers is crucial because many of these same abilities are still associated with him in modern occult practices and conspiracy theories. Saturn's most famous and feared ability was his complete control over time itself. This wasn't just symbolic according to Roman religious texts and the secret writings of his priests. Saturn could actually slow down, speed up, or even stop time in specific areas. The historian Tacitus mentions several occasions when Saturn's priests demonstrated this power in front of witnesses, including one incident where a priest made the sun appear to stand still in the sky for several hours during a religious ceremony, but this control over time had a dark side. Saturn could also age people rapidly as a form of punishment, turning young men into elderly, dying figures in a matter of minutes. Ancient accounts describe criminals who were sentenced to Saturns, judgment aging decades in the time it took to walk across a temple courtyard. Even more disturbing was Saturn's power to show people their own deaths. This wasn't just fortune-telling. Saturn could make people actually experience their future death as if it was happening right now, feeling every moment of pain, fear, and sadness that would come at the end of their lives. Roman sources describe this as one of the most horrible punishments possible, worse than actual torture, because victims would live through their death over and over again until they either went insane or begged Saturn for mercy. Some people who experienced this power became so terrified of their future that they spent the rest of their lives trying to change their fate, often making the very decisions that led to the death Saturn had shown them. Saturn's second major power was his dominion over agriculture and the seasons, but this went far beyond just helping crops grow. Ancient texts describe Saturn as being able to make entire regions fertile or barren with just a thought. During times when his cult was respected and properly worshipped, harvests would be abundant and food would be plentiful. But when people neglected Saturn's rites or angered his priests, entire kingdoms could face years of famine and crop failure. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder documented several cases where regions that stopped worshipping Saturn experienced mysterious crop diseases that couldn't be cured by normal farming methods, while neighboring areas that maintained Saturn's temples continued to have successful harvests. But Saturn's control over growth and fertility had a sinister aspect that connected directly to his cannibalistic nature. He could make crops grow using the nutrients from dead bodies, and his priests often buried sacrificial victims in temple gardens to enhance the power of their rituals. Archaeological evidence from Saturn temple sites across the Roman Empire shows unusual plant growth patterns and soil composition that suggests human remains were regularly used as fertilizer. Even more disturbing, some ancient accounts claim that food grown in Saturn's sacred gardens had strange effects on people who ate it, causing them to have prophetic dreams or visions of death. Saturn's third major power was his mastery over death and the afterlife. Unlike other death gods who simply ruled over the dead, Saturn could actually prevent people from dying or force them to remain alive when they should have passed on. Ancient sources describe this as one of his cruelest abilities, keeping people alive in states of extreme old age, disease, or injury as a form of eternal punishment. Roman medical texts mention several cases of people who seemed to be cursed by Saturn, living for impossibly long periods while suffering from conditions that should have killed them quickly. These victims would beg for death, but found that their bodies refused to give up, trapped in endless cycles of pain and decay. Saturn could also communicate with the spirits of the dead and force them to serve him. His priests claimed they could summon ghosts of deceased people and compel them to answer questions about the future or reveal hidden secrets. This power made Saturn's cult incredibly valuable to politicians and military leaders who wanted information about their enemies or insight into upcoming events. The Roman Emperor Tiberius was known to regularly consult Saturn's priests for necromantic advice, and several important military campaigns were planned based on information gathered from the dead through Saturn's power. The fourth power that made Saturn truly terrifying was his ability to teach forbidden knowledge to his followers. This wasn't just religious wisdom. Saturn's priests claimed he could reveal the deepest secrets of the universe, including how to manipulate time, predict the future with perfect accuracy, and even achieve a form of immortality. But this knowledge came with a terrible price. People who learned Saturn's secrets found that the information slowly drove them insane, filling their minds with visions of cosmic horror and the meaninglessness of human existence. Many of Saturn's most devoted followers ended up committing suicide or becoming completely detached from normal human emotions and relationships. Saturn could also grant his followers the ability to see through deception and illusion, allowing them to recognize lies and hidden motives in other people. This made his priests incredibly valuable as advisors and judges. But it also made them deeply unhappy because they could never again experience the comfort of ignorance or self-deception. They saw the world exactly as it was: brutal, meaningless, and full of suffering without any of the illusions that make life bearable for normal people. Finally, Saturn had the power to impose limitations and restrictions on both gods and mortals. This was perhaps his most unique ability, while other gods granted freedom and power. Saturn specialized in creating boundaries, rules, and constraints that couldn't be broken. He could bind other supernatural beings with invisible chains, force people to follow specific patterns of behavior, and create situations where individuals had no choice but to accept their fate. This power of limitation extended to entire civilizations. Saturn could cause kingdoms to become trapped in cycles of rise and fall, ensuring that no human empire would ever become too powerful or last too long. What made all of these powers even more frightening was that Saturn rarely used them in obvious ways. Instead of dramatic displays of divine might, he preferred to work slowly and subtly, influencing events over decades or centuries until his will was accomplished. This patience and long-term thinking made him nearly impossible to fight against, because by the time people realized Saturn was working against them, his plans were all ready to advance to stop. But Saturn's true significance goes far deeper than just his mythological stories and ancient worship. He represents some of the most fundamental and terrifying aspects of human existence that we still struggle with today. To really understand why Saturn's cult has survived in various forms for over 2,000 years, we need to look at what he symbolizes on a psychological and spiritual level, because these symbols reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature that most people would rather ignore. At his core, Saturn represents the harsh father figure who teaches through suffering and limitation. Unlike the nurturing mother goddess or the inspiring hero god, Saturn embodies the principle that growth only comes through restriction, pain, and facing our own mortality. This is why he's shown eating his children, not because he's evil, because he represents the natural law that each generation must be consumed by time to make room for the next. In psychological terms, Saturn is the part of our minds that forces us to grow up, accept responsibility, and face the reality that life is difficult and ultimately ends in death. This connects to what psychologists call the Senex archetype, the wise old man who has seen everything and knows that most human hopes and dreams are illusions. The Senex isn't cruel by choice, but he understands that false hope causes more suffering than harsh truth. Saturn's scythe doesn't just cut down crops, it cuts away everything in our lives that isn't essential, stripping away our fantasies and forcing us to deal with what's actually real. This is why encounters with Saturn are described as so terrifying. He shows people exactly who they really are beneath all their self-deceptions and social masks. Saturn also represents the concept of time as a destructive force rather than a neutral background for events. In most modern thinking, we see time as just a measurement, like inches or pounds. But Saturn embodies the ancient understanding that time is actually an active force that devours everything it touches. Every second that passes brings us closer to death, every day ages our bodies, and every year takes away possibilities that will never return. Saturn's role as the god of time means he's constantly reminding us that everything we love will eventually be lost, and all our achievements will eventually be forgotten. This connection to time also explains Saturn's association with depression and melancholy in ancient astrology. People born under Saturn's influence were thought to be naturally sad because they could see the temporary nature of all earthly pleasures. They understood intuitively that success, relationships, and even life itself are just brief interruptions in an eternal cycle of loss and decay. Modern psychology has confirmed that people who are more aware of death and aging tend to experience higher levels of anxiety and depression, suggesting that the ancients understood something important about the relationship between wisdom and suffering. But Saturn's symbolism isn't entirely negative. He also represents the wisdom that can only come through accepting limitations. In alchemical traditions, Saturn is associated with the metal lead, which seems worthless and heavy, but is actually essential for creating more precious substances. This teaches us that our restrictions, failures, and painful experiences aren't just obstacles to overcome, they're the raw materials we need to develop real strength and wisdom. Saturn's lessons are harsh, but they're also necessary for anyone who wants to understand reality instead of living in comfortable fantasies. Saturn's role as the planetary ruler of Saturday also connects him to the idea of rest and reflection. The Jewish Sabbath and the modern weekend both echo ancient Saturn worship. Recognizing that regular periods of stopping work and contemplating deeper questions are essential for human well-being, But Saturn's rest isn't the comfortable relaxation we might want, it's the sometimes uncomfortable process of looking honestly at our lives and asking whether we're living according to our deepest values or just following social expectations. The most disturbing aspect of Saturn's symbolism is his representation of the shadow side of authority and government. Saturn doesn't just rule, he rules through fear, restriction, and the threat of punishment. This connects to modern concerns about authoritarian governments and social control systems that claim to protect people while actually limiting their freedom. Saturn's cult practiced human sacrifice, not because they were evil, but because they understood that all governments ultimately maintain power through the threat of violence. The chains that bound Saturn's statue in Rome weren't just symbolic. They represented the invisible chains that all societies place on their citizens in exchange for security and order. Saturn also embodies the principle that all parents eventually become destroyers of their children's innocence. Just as Saturn ate his babies, every parent must eventually introduce their children to the harsh realities of adult life, death, betrayal, injustice, and the fact that the world doesn't care about their individual happiness. This isn't cruelty, but it's still a form of destruction. The child's innocent worldview must die so that the adult's realistic worldview can be born. Perhaps most importantly, Saturn represents the part of spiritual development that most people want to avoid. The dark night of the soul, when all our previous beliefs and identities fall apart. In mystical traditions, this Saturn phase is considered essential for real spiritual growth. But it's also the point where many people give up their spiritual seeking and return to ordinary life. Saturn strips away everything that isn't truly real, including our comfortable religious beliefs and New Age fantasies, leaving us face to face with the raw mystery of existence. The danger in Saturn's teachings is that they can lead to nihilism and despair if taken too far. People who become too identified with Saturn's energy often lose their ability to experience joy, hope, or love, seeing these emotions as mere illusions that distract from life's fundamental meaninglessness. This is why Saturn's cult was always balanced with other forms of worship in healthy societies. His wisdom is necessary, but it needs to be combined with more life-affirming energies to avoid spiritual death. Understanding Saturn's symbolism helps explain why his influence appears so often in modern conspiracy theories and occult practices. He represents the hidden forces that shape society from behind the scenes, the uncomfortable truths that most people don't want to face, and the long-term cycles that make individual human lives seem insignificant. Whether you believe in Saturn as a literal deity or just as a psychological symbol, his energy touches everyone who's ever felt the weight of time, the inevitability of death, or the restrictions that society places on individual freedom. But here's where Saturn's story becomes really disturbing for modern audiences. His influence didn't disappear when the Roman Empire fell. Instead, it went underground and evolved, appearing in ways that most people never notice but that profoundly shape our contemporary world. From Hollywood movies to corporate logos, from government buildings to secret societies, Saturn's symbolism is everywhere around us. And understanding these connections reveals some uncomfortable truths about how power really works in our society. Let's start with one of the most obvious examples that millions of people see every day, the black cube. This simple geometric shape appears constantly in modern art, architecture, and corporate branding. But most people have no idea that it's actually an ancient symbol of Saturn worship. In traditional astrology and occult practices, Saturn is associated with the cube because it represents limitation, structure, and the material world that traps human souls. The most famous example is the Kaaba in Mecca, the black cube structure that millions of Muslims pray toward 5 times a day. While this isn't necessarily connected to Saturn worship in Islamic theology, the symbol itself has deep roots in pre-Islamic traditions that were heavily influenced by Saturn. Cults throughout the Middle East, but the black cube shows up in much more subtle ways throughout modern culture. Major corporations like Apple, Microsoft, and countless others use cube imagery in their logos and building designs. The famous sculpture in New York City called the Cube rotates constantly, symbolizing Saturn's role as the god of time and cycles. Even children's toys like Rubik's Cubes unconsciously train young minds to associate problem-solving with manipulating cube structures, connecting play and learning to Saturn's geometric symbol. Hollywood has been particularly fascinated with Saturn symbolism, often in ways that the general audience never consciously notices. Stanley Kubrick's movie, 2001, A Space Odyssey, features a mysterious black monolith that appears at crucial moments in human evolution. This monolith is clearly rectangular, representing Saturn's cube in vertical form. The movie suggests that human development is being guided by unseen forces, which perfectly matches Saturn's role as the hidden ruler who shapes civilizations from behind the scenes. Kubrick was known for his interest in occult symbolism, and many film analysts believe he deliberately included Saturn references throughout his work. The movie The Shining is even more explicit in its Saturn symbolism. The hotel where the story takes place is built on an ancient burial ground, connecting to Saturn's dominion over death and the past. The main character's descent into madness mirrors the traditional experience of Saturn's influence. Time becomes distorted, reality breaks